anthropology is the study of humans. It's a very broad field. So in our program, we had a 4-field anthropology department that will include biological anthropologists, which is the area I specialized in, archaeologists, that's what Dr. Lemke specializes in. We also shared our department with linguistic anthropologists who study language and sociocultural anthropologists who study the culture of living people. So as I mentioned, archaeology is a subfield of anthropology, and put really simply, the goal of archaeology is to understand humans by studying their material culture. So after that intro to the subject matter, I wanted to give an introduction to our guest, who we are so excited to have here. Her name is Dr. Ashley Lemke, and she is an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at the University of Texas at Arlington. And she is also the chair of the Advisory Council on Underwater Archaeology, which is really exciting, and we look forward to hearing a bit more about that. Some of her research interests include underwater archaeology, as you may have guessed, indigenous archaeology, and hunter-gatherers. And just a few things that I pulled out that I thought were really impressive, so you can get to know her a little better. She has conducted archaeological research in several areas in the United States, including in Texas, at the University of Michigan, where we went to school. So she's conducted archaeological research in Michigan, also abroad in countries such as Romania, Spain, and Germany. She is a published author, having many articles and even a book to her name, and she has also received funding from the National Science Foundation and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. So now I'm excited to get to the fun stuff. I promise you this is an exciting story. We've got woolly mammoths, we've got underwater adventures, we've got sidekick robots, it's got everything. So without further ado, I'm going to switch things over to Ashley Lemke. So help me welcome her, giving her a warm Centenary College welcome.
Okay, well, thank you for having me virtually. I actually have been to your college before, in the pre-COVID times, so I can kind of imagine what it would be like if I was there. I want to, of course, thank Dr. Hansen for inviting me, as well as all the organizers of this event. I think I kind of looked about what the other people have done, and it's a really cool thing to get to talk to you all about my research, of course, but also in terms of it being Women's History Month, to get to touch on some of those issues as well. So I want to also point out that Dr. Hansen has also done archaeological research in the state of Michigan. Once, when we were graduate students, she came up to Michigan, or went up to northern Michigan with me, and we did some archaeology together, so it was really fun. So what I plan to do today is I'm just gonna chat for about 20 minutes or so, maybe a little bit longer, to give you an idea a little bit more about what I do as an underwater archaeologist. And then, like Dr. Hansen said, we're going to open it up for questions. I'm happy to talk about anything you want, either what it's like to do underwater archaeology in general, or work on land, or being a woman doing this kind of research, any of those things. So without more ado, I want to, obviously, this is just a background. Underwater archaeology and conducting research in masculine spaces is kind of the idea of the event. So I'm going to touch on that a little bit throughout the talk, but I wanted to give you, kind of like Dr. Hansen did, a brief introduction of like who I am and where I came from, and how I came to do underwater archaeology. So I was that kid that always watched the History Channel when I was younger. I occasionally watch cartoons, but mostly was super fascinated by ancient Egypt and Rome and Greece. And I always have been really fascinated by history, and couldn't wait to get my hands dirty, as it was, and really start actually excavating history and learning about our past. So I went to school to be an archaeologist, but I didn't really know how to do that. It's kind of hard to find archaeology classes because they're in anthropology, like Dr. Hansen mentioned. So I started taking anthropology classes, and they're all about humans and a little bit about human biology, human language, human culture. But it was the part about physical evidence, things like arrowheads or ancient pottery or historical records, that got me the most fascinated, and really is what led to me going first to the University of Texas for my undergraduate degree. And then I went to the University of Michigan for my master's and my PhD. Always focused on archaeology, but learning a lot about human cultures in general, and obviously meeting people with diverse interests like Dr. Hansen. So I think this is one of the most important parts about archaeology, is that it's a really specialized field. It's really pretty, some people call it a hard science, people call it a social science, people call it just a science or a humanity. And it's a little bit of all those things. It's a little bit of history and a little bit of physics and a little bit of chemistry and a little bit of culture, like all wrapped up together to ultimately understand peoples in the past. So in terms of where my research has kind of taken me, Dr. Hansen mentioned this a little bit, but I started out digging in Texas, actually. So this is a picture of like the young archaeologist, as it were, in Texas at what was the very first archaeological site I ever visited and I got to work at. It is a 12,000-year-old site that has a lot of stone tools as well as animal bones, including a woolly mammoth that ancient peoples hunted and then we're eating, right? So it's this really cool place in Texas. And one of the things that really attracted me to it was people, including me when I was a little kid, always think of archaeology being elsewhere. You always think of it being in Egypt or Rome or Africa or Asia. But there's so much archaeology in North America. It's really pretty surprising. And a lot of people don't know very much about it. We don't learn a lot in our history classes about things that are very old. So before, like early European colonialists on the Eastern Seaboard, like we don't know very much about Native Americans or Native American history or Native American prehistory. So I have worked in other countries, but most of my research has been here in the US, in Texas, and then also in Michigan. So anthropology and archaeology are related, like we talked about. I started out as like a very standard traditional archaeologist and worked on sites on land at first. I think one of the more interesting things that I've noticed being an archaeologist is that there's anthropology is really big, and then archaeology is a little bit smaller and more specialized. And then within archaeology, there's all these different specialties. So you can be a Mayan archaeologist, or you can be an ancient Egyptian archaeologist, or you can be someone who studies animal bones, or someone who studies human bones. There's all these technical specialties, and the gender makeup of those specialties is really different. So some things like people who study stone tools, that's like 99% men. And I have some ideas of why that might be, and that might be an interesting thing to get into with the chat, but certain specialties that you have within the archaeology field are really gender dominated. So some are male dominated, and things like zooarchaeology, that's the study of animal bones, that's actually almost all female or much more female dominated. So it's kind of interesting when you start breaking down and getting into the more finer grained details about the type of research people do. I kind of do a little bit of all these different things, and sometimes I'll be in the field and it will be, the majority will be women. And sometimes I'll be in the field on a different project and the majority of people will be men. So it kind of depends on what you're doing and where you're working in the world, in terms of kind of the gender makeup of what you're working on. In general, kind of giving away the story, archaeology has tended to be very male dominated. It's getting less so. It's almost like 50-50 now. And as a field, what we're working on instead is getting more diversity. So moving beyond gender, but things like socioeconomic background and ethnicity and culture and sexual orientation and all these things, we're trying to make the field more diverse. Moving beyond gender equity, because we kind of have that now in archaeology, most parts of it, which is good. Oh, that's the woolly mammoth. I can't go that far without like introducing you to. This is one of the mammoths that I've excavated. a lot of early archaeological sites are what we call mammoth kill excavations. So areas where prehistoric peoples killed a mammoth. And then, as you can imagine, they're kind of easy to find because they're huge and gigantic and they look very strange. So this particular one was actually found by a soybean farmer in Michigan. So archaeologists aren't always the ones that find archaeological sites. More often than not, honestly, it's farmers or people who are walking in the field or people who just happen to find an artifact and ask about it. So in this particular situation, the soybean farmer was putting an irrigation pipeline for the spring in Michigan before it started freezing. And he hit at first the scapula, so the shoulder blade of a mammoth. He was like, well, that's weird. It's bigger than a cow bone, but I don't know what it is. So he called the University of Michigan and a team of us went out and he gave us 1 day to excavate this mammoth out of the ground, which is really unusual. But he really wanted to get the piping in. Like he was like, whatever, take the mammoth. I don't care. Like I just need to like get water to my crops. So we excavated this. It's in pretty good condition. Those white plastic strips are actually zip ties that we were tying around the tusk because they started cracking and falling apart when we were excavating it. So we had to zip tie it all together. And it's kind of what we call rescue archaeology, where you have a situation and you want to get in and try to get those artifacts and map them to the best of your ability and save it because you're not sure it would probably be destroyed, right? If we didn't go and excavate it. So that's the story with the mammoth. Moving on to this underwater archaeology bit. So that's what I specialize in now. It's something that it just kind of, I was kind of in the right place at the right time as a lot of research happens. I was working in a lab in Texas. There was a colleague of mine there who was from Florida. He was a scuba diver. And he's like, I really want to see if there's early archaeological sites in the Gulf of Mexico. And do you want to come on this boat? And I was like, of course I want to come on a boat, like, sure. And I didn't know anything about it. I, at the time, had no idea why there would be archaeological sites in the Gulf of Mexico. But there's underwater archaeological sites all over the world because of much lower sea levels at the end of the Ice Age. So you have to imagine these pictures of Google Earth having really, really, really large glaciers all the way around, like especially the top, all of Canada would have been covered in ice, the end of the last Ice Age. And because there was so much of the world's ocean of the water sucked up into those giant ice sheets, the water levels across the whole globe were much lower, which exposed a lot of land. And I wanted to show you these images from Google Earth because I don't know if you can see my pointer, but everything that's that light color, you know what? I've got a pen. All of these areas that are really light colors, these are the continental shelves. So they're these kind of broad, pretty shallow coastal plains that go out from the modern day shoreline. And that all would have been dry land around 10,000 years ago at the end of the last Ice Age. This is, of course, the whole eastern seaboard would have looked a lot different. The coastline would have been miles out from where it is now. Over in Australia and Polynesia, there's this big continental shelf right here. That would have been one continent. And all of that would have been connected at the end of the last Ice Age. It actually has a name. That continent is Sahul. That all would have been an area where people could have been living, people could have been hunting and gathering and chatting and gossiping and living. And now it's underwater because those ice sheets eventually melted and the water levels got closer to what they are now. So underwater archaeology, people tend to think it's shipwrecks, and that's a big part of it. But exploring these continental shelves that have early archaeological site, that's like a new big field. And that's primarily what I've worked on for the last, I don't even know, several years, at least probably 10 now. Oh, my little drawings are still there. That's cute. So I unshared my screen so I could move my drawings. There you go. Where I've been doing most of my underwater research is actually in the Great Lakes. So up on the coast off of Michigan in Lake Huron. And one of the primary benefits of working in the Great Lakes is there are no sharks, which is not always true to other places where I have worked underwater. I respect them a lot, which is why I know to be slightly cautious. But in the Great Lakes, there's no salt, there's no sharks, and it's been a really fantastic and really exciting place to work. since I was a graduate student, all the way up until now. I've been working there since 2013. So that kind of issue I was talking about earlier with these much lower sea levels, this is showing you again a map from Google Earth of the UK and Northern England. This all same thing, that whole continental shelf would have been dry land as well. That continent also has a name, it's called Dodgerland. And these same kind of issues that happen on continental shelves actually happened in the Great Lakes too. So water levels in the Great Lakes were much lower at the end of the last ice age. A lot of that water again was frozen. And in Lake Huron, there is a land bridge that is called the Alpena Amberley Ridge that would have been dry land around 9,000 years ago. And that is where I spent a lot of my time working on that particular feature. So to give you a better idea of what this looks like, the image you're looking at is actually courtesy of National Geographic. So they do a series of television shows that are called Drain the Oceans, which are really cool. So if you've ever seen them, check them out. They did one called Drain the Great Lakes, where they did exactly what it sounds like. They digitally drain the water out of the Great Lakes to see kind of what was on that bottom surface. And this map is showing you how much dry land there would have been around 9,000 years ago. So everything green is the modern land now, like the way it would have looked like in Michigan and Ontario. Everything brown is what would have been dry land. So it's this huge expanse of land that people and animals were living on, that there's rooted intact trees out there that we've been investigating. And that kind of rocky ridge that goes across the whole basin, that's called the Alpena Amberley Ridge, which is that same landform that I've been working on. So now it's 80 to 120 feet underwater, depending on where you're at along that ridge. It was dry land. This is like very technical archaeology dating terms or numbers, but from about 11,000 years ago to 8,000 years ago, it was dry land. And most of the archaeological sites that we have been investigating are around 9,000 years old. So these people did not have agriculture. They definitely had domesticated dogs, which is cool. They would have been hunting wild animals, collecting wild plants, but otherwise were like exactly like you and me. They were humans. They had complicated lives. They just happened to be living in a kind of ice age environment. So in terms of some of the underwater tech that I used, because we promised you robots, there's two. These are my favorite. So there's a lot of different kinds of sonar, other mapping equipment that I use, but these are the two I use the most. The one on the left, which should be your left too, is an autonomous underwater vehicle. So this looks like a torpedo and it kind of acts like one. Honestly, you program it in a little mapping software and you tell it where you want it to drive and you literally throw it over the side of your boat. It drives around on the surface for a while. It has that little thing that's sticking up to talk to GPS satellites, and then it gets on track where it's supposed to go. It dives itself and goes underwater and then drives really close to the bottom and maps like the bottom topography and looks for archaeological sites. So it's called autonomous because it is, right? It's not connected to the boat at all. You're not remotely controlling it. You tell it where to go and then it just drives itself. These really stress people out when you first throw it over the boat because this one is a cheap one and it was $350,000. So although it's autonomous and it's like supposed to just go by itself, we just follow it around in our boat and then wait for it to pop up and everyone's like crossing their fingers on the boat to make sure it actually like comes to the surface, because people have lost these before. We have not, knock on wood. But that's one of the coolest things in terms of tech. Like when I was a little kid or when I was a student and an undergraduate, like some of you guys are now, I never would have thought that I would be using autonomous underwater vehicles like underwater at all. But these are just skills that I've got to learn from being an underwater archaeologist. The other one is Jake, his name. This is a remote operated vehicle. So this one, you can see it's kind of got that green line behind it. This one is connected to your boat. So it is a remote operated vehicle. It's not autonomous. It can't drive itself. You as a pilot, which is what I do, have a video camera on the surface and a little joystick, like a whole host of buttons and other features. And you see exactly what it's seeing underwater. It's a live video feed that goes up to the boat. So Jake and ROVs in general are really, really important for underwater research. People don't use them on shipwrecks very much because they have that cable. So if you go and you think you're driving into a shipwreck and like driving around, the cable can get stuck on things, which you don't want to have happen. So we use them a lot though for investigating like bigger open spaces underwater. So a little bit more about these things. I found this picture when I was putting these slides together, and I was like, oh, this is great for like masculine spaces. This is what a typical day on the boat looks like. This is actually, I set my camera as a timer, so there's just the 4 of us on the boat. I don't know how to give like a good indication of how small this boat is. That's like half of it that's in the picture. So it's a 23-foot fishing boat. It does not have a bathroom, which is a very interesting thing to get into in terms of like gender equity and like all these things. But this is honestly, this is like a very typical day. 99% of the time, I'm the only woman on our research trips. It's a small group of people that we go out with to do this research. I've been on projects where you kind of go out for a day and then come back at night and like stay in a hotel. I've been on projects where you sleep on the boat and you're out for weeks at a time. It just kind of depends on where you are and how big the boat is. But this is us out doing a survey looking for underwater archaeological sites using the AUV, the Autonomous Underwater Vehicle. And obviously we have a really good time. You can tell from the photo that nothing negative is happening, which is awesome. But it is not uncommon for me to be the only woman that does this research. Whereas archaeology is getting better in terms of gender equity, in terms of marine technology. That's really still not the case. It's a really, really, really male dominated field. Okay, so a little bit more about the remote operated vehicle. This one is, it's not that heavy and it's not that big. Jake is like, yay, long. I can lift it up and down out of the water. It's probably about 50 pounds, maybe 75, somewhere in that ballpark. The cable actually is what's the heaviest, but this is a really critical tool because it is a robot and it doesn't have to breathe underwater, unlike scuba divers. So I'm a scuba diver now, and we have a lot of people who are scuba divers who work on this project, but it's so deep that you only have so much time you can be underwater, right? Like you have a tank or 2 on your back. So you only have so much time that you can go down and excavate artifacts or look for stone tools or look for pottery. So what we often do is send Jake, the robot, first. He checks out all the archaeological sites, obviously me piloting him from the boat, looks for all the sites, finds a good area to maybe take some samples or look for artifacts. And that's its first job. Its second job, it has that kind of little beacon that's sitting on the back of it that you can see in the photos. That's a GPS locator. So the boat knows exactly where that robot is at all times. So if we find an artifact or we find something like a 9,000-year-old rooted intact tree, which we found, you drive the robot over to it, you kind of hover by it, and then you can get an exact location of where that artifact is underwater. So that's like its second main job. The third main job for the remote operated vehicle is really safety, honestly. Because it has a live feed to the boat, I can monitor all the scuba divers and see what they're doing. So sometimes people get like, you know, they break apart, they can't see each other, they're kind of doing their own thing. But because Jake is yellow and it's loud, it has motors that run constantly. The divers can always see and hear the robot. So if they ever need anything, they can swim over to it. They can signal to us on the boat, right? Because it's that live video. So it's also a really good safety feature too for diving in what is very cold and really deep water. And we also work 50 miles offshore, so you can't see land when you're out on this particular project. Okay, so that's kind of like what I do. Before we like break it open into Q&A, I wanted to give a brief introduction to what I find, of course, to be like very inspirational women in terms of one's an underwater archaeologist and one's a marine biologist. So Honor Frost is one of the world's most pioneering underwater archaeologists. She was born in Cyprus and did extensive underwater archaeological research in Italy, in Egypt, as well as in Turkey. She is really well known still for her study of ancient stone anchors. So she's actually holding one of these stone anchors that's a Bronze Age. It's from a Bronze Age shipwreck. It's like one of the oldest shipwrecks in the world. And that's what anchors used to look like. So she's super famous for that. She did an amazing archaeology illustrations and worked on shipwrecks all over the world. I just recently learned that she was one of the people, like the person who basically found a shipwreck in the Mediterranean. So somebody knew it was there, but she was the first person that said, hey, this is really important for archaeology. This isn't just a shipwreck. It's a really old shipwreck and we don't know anything about these. And that discovery is always thought of as being this guy, George Bass. And it was actually her that made that discovery and basically started underwater archaeology, which is really cool. If people are more curious about underwater archaeology, there is something called the Honor Frost Foundation. When she passed away, donated essentially all of her money to start this foundation, which promotes research in the Eastern Mediterranean. So Honor Frost is one of the most pioneering women underwater archaeologists. And then Dr. Sylvia Earle, I think you might know, I think like you probably, this is like one of your like heroes too, Dr. Hansen. She's an American marine biologist. She lived underwater for over thousands of hours in either submarines or in complete living habitats. She was the first female chief scientist of NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. In 1998, she was the very first person to be named the hero for the Planet of Time magazine, which is really cool. And she is still so active today. I watched her give a webinar like 3 days ago. She has a company that's called, or like kind of a nonprofit called Mission Blue, and it inspires action to explore and protect the ocean. So it's not just for science or it's not just archaeology. It's understanding how important the ocean is in general for us as a species moving forward, given climate change and everything else. So Sylvia Earle is someone who continues to inspire not just women, but people all over the world to be more interested in protecting the ocean and knowing what we can learn from it. So with that, I'm going to stop talking formally, but I want to thank everybody again for attending. And then I put my email at the bottom in case anyone has questions later. But otherwise, I'm happy to chat and answer any questions you might have now.
All right, thank you so much. I know everyone joins me in appreciation of your talk. I think I removed your spotlight. I think if you want to unshare your screen, then we'll both show up.
Oh, there we go.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So I did see that we had some comments and questions in our Q&A. Again, if you joined us a little later, the chat unfortunately is a little unreliable, so we are relying on the Q&A. So please feel free to post comments or questions in there. So I think I'll tackle these questions in sort of a little bit reverse order than they were posed. I do think Mars posed one about Native American history, which I could see that being a longer conversation. And I know that Dr. Lemke is a great person to fill us in on some of those issues. So I thought I'd start with some of the ones that were a little bit quicker before we delve into that very deserving topic. So we do seem to have a lot of curiosity about bathroom related issues. And as someone who has lived in the rainforest with mostly men, I have been exposed to the challenges that come along with being a lady who needs to pee, and it's a little bit more challenging sometimes in that case. So some questions we have from Dr. Grove. I am going to require more bathroom information, please. I have watched Deadliest Catch, if that helps. And a second comment question from anonymous attendee. If there is no bathroom, how long can you stay out on the water? So Dr. Lemke, your bathroom thoughts and comments, please.
All good questions. Yeah, I to be honest, when I was thinking about this, I was like, Dr. Henson should be on this panel. In terms of being like a woman who's worked in, like she said, challenging environments in like more ways than one that aren't just like gender dominated by one or the other, but like living in a rainforest. So, okay. So in terms of how long can you stay on the water? Like, excellent question. So our boat, the small boat where I work on in the Great Lakes, we go in every day. That said, I feel like I need to like elaborate. So there's no formal bathroom, but there is a giant lake that surrounds the boat. So people obviously like urinate and obviously use the bathroom. You essentially literally just hang off like the back of the boat. So we have come up with a lingo for this. We refer to it as checking the engines because there's a small platform that has like the engines, right? So there's like the boat, there's engines, and then there's a platform. So we're like, oh, I gotta go check the engines. And then everybody knows basically to like, if it's me, they stay inside, like all the men like run into the cabin of the boat. And then like nobody can see anything. Like I just kind of like basically like duck down and like hang off the boat. If it's guys, like they just pee over the side of the boat. They occasionally forget to be like, I'm checking the engines. Like that's happened on more than one occasion. But yeah, so I think the way that we have dealt with it in the sense of like the very practical, like we usually work on the boat for like 12-hour days. It's like, and you want to stay hydrated, right? So like at the very least, like people need to pee. And we've kind of come up with that like lingo of how to do it. There were bathrooms on like bigger research vessels. They're called marine heads. They're like, there's showers, there's bathrooms, there's like the whole 9 yards. So when I worked in the Gulf of Mexico and we were out for 2 weeks, like it's no big deal. It's just, it's as if you're on land and there are bathrooms all over the place.
Very good. Who knew the topics we'd be covering? Someone also brought up the topic of menstrual issues. This is certainly a thing that is, if you are a person who menstruates, something if you decide to do what is referred to as field work, it is certainly an issue that is something that, you know, many people don't have to think about. So this was, I knew when I was living in Uganda in the jungle, I had to bring everything with me because I wasn't able to go to say like a city or town and buy them. So I don't know if you have any comments on that, but I assume that is a challenge working out in an area without bathrooms for a long period of time without, you know, any privacy either. That doesn't sound fun.
Yeah, so I'm really comfortable talking about this. Hopefully like the audience is really comfortable hearing about it. This has actually come up in the field, like both on land archaeology and like on the boat. So what I would say about this is like, as a woman, when I was like growing up in archaeology, no one talked to me about any of these things. It's just like, go out there and discover, you know what I mean? And it's as a professor now, and as someone who regularly takes students to the field, I am really open with them so they know that they can ask me any questions and I just like address these off the bat. So I talk about it. I always make sure that there is basically like privacy for my students when we're in the field, and that they have access to everything that they need. I've had issues where we've been in the middle of nowhere on a ranch and people were like flushing feminine products and shut off our water supply for 3 days in Texas in 100-degree weather. So it's conversations that you have to have so people know, right? Like not even just like where to dispose things is really important when you are working in a situation where you don't have regular plumbing, right? Or like regular like garbage cans and things like this. On the boat, that's like next level because they just don't, you know, they're like dudes, like they aren't expecting this to like be an issue, and I work on the water like all year long, so it's not like I can time it. You know what I mean, where you're like not out there when you have to deal with these issues. Kind of like Bethany, like it's like a pack in pack out situation. It's almost, if you think when you're at like a national park, it's like leave no trace. So I bring everything that I need. I also bring extras of everything I need in case I do ever have another female colleague. And then I make privacy in the cabin of the boat. And I've like basically done that in like sneaky enough ways that I'm not like announcing to everyone that I'm working with, but I think it's, you know, it's A, it happens every month, and B, it's 50% of the population. So I think if anything, like having more conversations about it is helpful. So you don't have women like what I did, you know, where you're just like on your own, basically. I think it's really nice to try to provide people with some guidance with these sorts of topics.
So I think if you're maybe a person who's a student or an assistant, a junior colleague, you absolutely deserve access to these things. And if it's not provided for you and not communicated to you, know that you deserve these things. And it can be hard, but either try to speak up for yourself or perhaps find a colleague or supervisor, whoever that can speak up on your behalf, because sometimes, as Dr. Lemke mentioned, in these male dominated areas, it's not something, sometimes it might be that they just don't know, and because it's not something they have to personally deal with. But hopefully, as we become more inclusive and diverse, these things are more talked about, more available, but certainly know that you deserve access to them.
And people have been great. Like when I brought it up, like my male colleagues have responded really well. And I think Dr. Henson made a good point. Like it just doesn't occur to them. So, you know, like I've been in the field and we were like all at dinner and somebody took her bag, like her big backpack, to the bathroom. And my colleague, who's male, was like, "Where's she going? Is she leaving?" And we're like, "She's just going to the bathroom." I'm like, "Stop talking." You know, so it just really does, honestly, like doesn't occur to people. So ask questions. Like you absolutely are entitled to access to everything you need, and like ask questions and just get in people's like space about it and just ask.
We had some comments too following up on this before we transition topics. Things, products such as the Diva Cup and period garments. I would say I did have, the question was, did you have female professors to help you navigate some of these issues around menstruation or say bathroom issues? I can say that I did not have female professors. The field site I worked at was run by two, we called them silverbacks. They're, you know, men in their 50s, 60s. But there were older female graduate students who would tell me, okay, here's what you do. You do this. You need to buy everything. You can't get it there. So I think a lot of what goes on now is kind of word of mouth. And that can be challenging maybe in some of the situations that Dr. Lemke brought up. If she's the only person, there may not be sort of in, you know, a female in a higher position that would be able to take her aside and say, hey, here's what you do. Sometimes you find yourself in these situations where you've got to, you know, carve the path. So sometimes you might have to have these, some people may find them uncomfortable. Some people might not find them uncomfortable conversations. I know this is something that happens too for women who are breastfeeding, and being able to find a place to do so that is not a bathroom, because shockingly, they don't want to feed their child in a place where people are using the bathroom. So these are all good comments that people are bringing up. We kind of have two big topics that maybe we could talk about for, let's say, 10 minutes each. Maybe we could do a quick dive into, we have some questions about tech side before we jump into diversity and Native American related issues. So one question is, what company builds the robots, and do you work on them and or know how to fix them if they break? I do know Jake has been to the hospital several times.
Jake has been to robot hospitals. Yeah, so the company that builds Jake in particular is called, they're in Slidell, Louisiana. It's called Outland Tech. And they just make that particular, they're right by you guys. They just make that particular model. Jake's been on their Instagram. He's like their biggest fan now. So I have shipped it. If it really breaks, you ship it to them. We had them to, like, Jake's really old. He worked for the Army. He was an Army robot before I got him. So he was like a vet that needed to go and get like new components.
You're saying that Jake is a veteran, is what?
Yes, yes.
A Louisiana-made veteran. Okay.
Yes. So he had to go to the hospital in Louisiana to get like a whole new monitor and like a new camera. So if you're like replacing component parts, you can send it to the company. I know how to do, he's a spy. I just saw it in the chat.
Yes.
I know how to do really basic things. So I can troubleshoot really well if something's not working. I have learned a lot about electronics in the last 2 years as Jake gets older and it needs more help. I know how to use a multimeter and a lot of things like this, just kind of like basic operations. So I can fix very basic things. I have learned how to splice a cable, which is actually the most important thing in case the umbilical, it's called an umbilical that runs Jake. If that gets caught on something and breaks, those are like $10,000 cables. So actually learning how to splice that cable back together is the most important skill. So long answer, I could talk about Jake all day long, so apologies, but really serious things you have where you can send it to the manufacturers. I also have a colleague on land in Michigan who works at a community college, and he teaches marine technology at the community college. They have a Jake themselves. They have the same one. So if we ever need anything like right away, that guy's like on land. He's repaired a lot for me too. And then you learn like a lot yourself as well.
Jake is a twin.
Yes. The twin's name is Elmer.
Elmer?
I like the Blues Brothers.
Oh, okay. Another maybe relatively quick question. Sounds like it is from a student. What should students who are interested in this technological side of archaeology do as undergrads? And specifically maybe for a place like Centenary College that doesn't have its own anthropology program or archaeology program?
Excellent question. So I would say you guys should contact Outland. Maybe I'll get a hold of Outland and see if they have like tours or anything like they could show people, because they're right there and they're like a huge company. I would say take things that you wouldn't necessarily think of taking, like basic like auto maintenance actually would be very helpful for someone who does field work. Like knowing how to jump a car and knowing how to use a multimeter or operating a boat, like stuff like that is actually really, really critical for field research, like no matter where you are. So things that are almost more like manual would be really, really helpful skills to have. There's so much information about underwater archaeology online. There are a lot of programs for scuba divers if people are more into that, but I would search out, I'll send a bunch of references and things too to Dr. Henson, but the Advisory Council on Underwater Archaeology would be one place that they have a website that have a lot of stuff about like the technology side of things.
Would you say that name one more time?
Oh yeah, the Advisory Council on Underwater Archaeology.
Great. And if there are any students in the audience right now that are looking for more information, you're more than welcome to get in contact with me. I know how to find this Dr. Lemke. I know where she is. We do have a comment from Dr. Grove, very excited, has found that Jake has his own Facebook page. I may or may not be friends Facebook with Jake. I will not comment on that. All right. So something that I thought may come up in this conversation was brought up by Dr. Alexander, issues related to diversity and archaeology. As Dr. Lemke mentioned, spoiler alert, we can definitely put archaeology into has traditionally been dominated by white men category. So her question was, what are underwater archaeology conferences like in terms of representation? Do they make an effort to have women speakers on panels?
Good question. It's so good actually. There is a conference that is called the Society for Historical and Underwater Archaeology, which is a mouthful. I'm on the board of that organization, and we just got into an agreement with the Society for Black Archaeologists. And there are a lot of actually African-American and African folks who are scuba divers. So this is like a whole really cool thing to look into. They're doing what's called the Slave Wrecks Project. So, right, basically, there are a ton of shipwrecks that are slave ships, and that's a huge unknown part of the story to tell. So organizations like Diving with a Purpose are training a huge diverse audience on how to scuba dive and like literally dive into their own history, which is very cool. The organization that I work with, the Advisory Council on Underwater Archaeology, ACUA, It's actually women dominated right now, but in terms of making sure they have women on panels, they just did a women and people of color panel at the conference this year online, which was really cool. So it was so neat that they broke it over into 2 days. So they had like women in diving, because as you can imagine, like we didn't even get into the scuba diving part. Scuba diving is also really male dominated, also really white male dominated. So women divers are a bigger kind of growing subfield, I would say, like diving while menstruating, diving while pregnant, diving while breastfeeding, like all that's really important, right? Because diving is really physiologically taxing. So yes, I would say that underwater archaeology conferences are doing a good job about getting women on panels, but like my hope is that we're not going to have panels on women in diving. You know what I mean? Like I want it to just be like diving and then you have a really diverse audience rather than having to call it out, but it is getting better.
All right. I thought that I did not mean to put Mars off, but I thought she brought up a really important topic, which relates to Native American history as it relates to archaeology. This is certainly something that deserves attention. It is sometimes thought of as a contentious area. So her comment was, I'm so glad that you talked about archaeology as it relates to Native American history. Can you talk about the process of creating a team to excavate land? Have you had to navigate being on protected lands before? Also, how do you honor the findings of cultures you and possibly your crew are not a part of? Do you consult cultural experts throughout the process or after? So many questions. Answer in whatever order you see fit. So I know that Dr. Lemke is uniquely poised to answer on this, so I will just turn it over to you.
Can you leave that one up? Oh wait,
I'll undismiss it.
Thanks. I was like, I want to make sure I touch it all. So
wait, reopen.
Amazing questions. And thank you for bringing it up too. Dr. Hansen mentioned at the very beginning that I do like indigenous archaeology. This is something that I have kind of realized I was doing the whole time, but now I can have that name to it, which I think is really important. So first of all, like I normally start talks with a land acknowledgement in terms of the tribes, right, that traditionally lived on the land where we are. In the Great Lakes, it's really complicated and we could have like a whole nother talk about that. But land is really sacred to a lot of different people. And as an anthropologist, that's like trained into you from like day one. There's a lot of really important things. We call it cultural relativism, is essentially like understanding a culture for its own merits and not judging it from your own background. And as an anthropologist, like that's my whole life. That's what I try to do every day. So there is a push. Some parts of the country are better than others about involving Native Americans in archaeology because, right, like as this question says, like it's not always a culture that you're directly part of, right? When I've worked internationally, it's in the places where I've worked, like Romania, it's been really cool because people think it's so neat that Americans want to learn about their history that they're like, come and dig here, that's so cool. Like they find it very respectful that you want to come and excavate their ancestors because other cultures, that's kind of showing them that Romania is a really important place and that it has an important history that we want to learn more about. And in North America, it's really different because there's this long, horrible, horrendous history of colonialization. And some Native American groups have their own archaeologists. Some are really interested in working with archaeologists, some aren't. It just really depends, and it's so variable and diverse across the country. In terms of protected lands, I have not worked in protected lands. I think in the sense that, like, I haven't worked on a reservation proper. The Great Lakes are protected, so I have permits from the state of Michigan, and those permits go out for review to all the Native American tribes in the area. So they can say if they don't want that permit to go through or not. I think that's really important. It's kind of like an informal consultation. I have permits from like the Army Corps of Engineers and all these other places. So most archaeology that's done that's not on private land, you have to get a permit, usually from the state, sometimes federal agencies, and sometimes other governments, like tribal governments. How do you honor the findings of the culture you are not a part of? Excellent question. For us as archaeologists, we never excavate a whole site. So archaeology is a destructive science, no matter if you're on land or if you're underwater, because you can't ever go back and dig up those artifacts again. Like once you dig them up, like you can't put them back. It's never going to be the same. So you always try to preserve some of the site for future archaeologists, but also try to preserve some of the site just so it's preserved intact. So we're very careful that we're not just like excavating everything, right? You are very careful as a scientist to only excavate what you absolutely need and to have a really clear plan. And to me, that's kind of honoring what we're finding, that you're really careful about what you're doing, that you're not just like, oh, I'm going to go dig up this whole site that's an ancient Native American site. Like, you know, I think that's really important to have a scientific plan in place and a reason for excavating. Like, I'm not just digging it up to dig it up. I'm digging it up to learn about these research questions. Yes, you absolutely consult cultural experts throughout the process and after. That is sometimes mandated, which is great. Because I think, as many of us know, like, unless you're told you have to do public outreach, many people won't do it. And public outreach is important, but to be frank with you, like, it's a lot of time. I could have a whole job doing public outreach and nothing else, but I have to teach and I have to write papers and I have to do all these other things. So consulting cultural experts is often mandated by the grant that you have. So when you get money to go and excavate these sites, they will say, like, you need to consult with these tribes. The biggest problem in the US for this is not all tribes are federally recognized. So there are so many indigenous groups in the United States that, for various historical reasons, are not federally recognized. So federal grants don't say that you have to talk to them, but oftentimes it'll like be their ancestors or their culture that you're excavating. So very good archaeologists are always anthropologists first and know how to properly honor and dialogue with a culture and be really careful about what they're doing. And respectful, I think, is like the biggest thing. This is a big, like, all good questions. It's a big topic in underwater archaeology because, like, it wasn't white people that were living here 10,000 years ago, right? Like, when those like water levels were lower. And I think for the most part, like, if you're willing to talk to people, like, they are also people, they are willing to work with you. And I've worked in Alaska with a native tribe up there, the native village of Kotzebue, and they've taught me so much and I've taught them so much, and it's just really cool back and forth. So it can be more valuable for people, but also like for the science, it's really important from that perspective too. You are muted. It wouldn't be like a virtual talk if one of us wasn't muted.
At least one time. Well, I'm not seeing any last minute questions or comments in the chat, and looking at the clock, I see that we are close to 7 p.m. One thing I wanted to end with is just again thanking you, Dr. Lemke, for sharing your career and your experiences with us. It's really exciting for us at Centenary, as we don't have our own resident anthropologists or archaeologists, that you could share this with us. I want to thank our audience for attending and helping us celebrate Women's History Month. I'm not sure if Dr. Donahoe is able to pop on for a second. We do, before we break for today, we do have another event next Tuesday, which I thought I had all ready to go. I'm not sure if Dr. Donahoe or Dr. Grove.
I don't have a slide or information for it, but Katia Confortini will be joining us to talk about the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. She is this super spicy, feisty Italian woman who is fiercely feminist and a great wealth of knowledge. She is just charming to listen to, and a mentor of mine. So I am particularly excited to welcome her. And it will be on Tuesday at 6.
I think it's same time, same place.
Same time, yeah, perfect.
Same time, 6 p.m. Tuesday, same place, Zoom. We look forward to seeing you then again. Thank you, Dr. Lemke. It was certainly a pleasure to hear about you and your research.
Thanks, everybody.
Big thank you from Centenary.